This is the Mondoweiss podcast. I'm Dave Reed. Protests continue in Israel. Last week, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu walked back his government's push to overhaul the Israeli judicial system, but did not abandon the effort. Instead, the government will take it up again in a few months when the Israeli parliament, the Knesset, returns from its spring recess. As part of the agreement to delay the legislation, a new National Guard force will be created under the control of the National Security Minister, Itamar Ben-Gvir. Dr. Yara Hawari, senior political analyst at the Palestinian think tank Al-Shabaka, says Itamar Ben-Gvir is an extremist. He's someone who has consistently called for violence against Palestinians throughout his political career. In today's episode, Mondoweiss Palestine news director Yumna Patel speaks with Dr. Hawari about developments in the protests and what they mean for Palestinians living under Israeli occupation and apartheid.
All right, Yara, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me.
Today, I just want to talk to you about these ongoing protests that we've been seeing in Israel over the past few weeks. For weeks, Israelis have taken to the streets and cities in Israel, primarily in Tel Aviv, in what are being described as pro-democracy protests. My first question is there even a democracy that exists in Israel to be saved?
Well, that's a really important point, Yumna, because the so-called pro-democracy protests are not about democracy for everyone that resides between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea. It's actually about preserving Jewish ethnocracy in the settler colonial state of Israel. And you'll notice from, the slogans of the protests, the demands of various protest groups, that this is not about dismantling that structure, which is inherently undemocratic. Rather, it's about preserving it, but reconfiguring it to perhaps a more liberal framework. And, the impetus of these demonstrations was the judicial overhaul that Netanyahu and his coalition government have been planning for some time, and that very judiciary that these protesters are so worried about and determined to preserve and protect has been the same judiciary that has overseen the oppression of Palestinians in multiple different ways, that has overseen, the demolition of Palestinian homes, the incarceration of Palestinian political prisoners. So it's very clear that these protests are not really about, the essence of democracy. Rather, they're about preserving or reconfiguring settler colonialism.
Yeah, so I think what you're saying is at the core of this issue. These protests for Israelis are about saving a democracy, or rather the way that you described it, a system of privilege for one group only, and that's Jewish Israelis.
Yeah, exactly. And you'll notice that, at some of the protests, maybe there've been sort of more liberal framings of this kind of privilege, or there've been protesters who have talked about the occupation or have brought in sort of anti-occupation slogans or banners. But the framing is still very limited to one that simply acknowledges the 1967 military occupation of the West Bank and Gaza, and not one that even begins to tackle the ideology of Zionism as a settler colonial ideology, which at its very core seeks to erase the indigenous Palestinian people from their homeland. So the protests, even when there have been blocs that have mentioned, or nodded towards the fact that there are Palestinians living under total Israeli control, the framing has been incredibly limited and has not even, considered how Palestinians might be viewing these protests.
So how would you describe the way that Palestinians view these protests, how you yourself as a Palestinian, almost looking funny enough, on sitting on the outside looking in, because Palestinians very much, as you've mentioned, are not a part of these protests or even this narrative at all. So how would you describe the way that these protests are viewed by Palestinians like yourself?
I mean, I think there's a general sense of bewilderment at the notion that these protests might have any kind of positive impact on Palestinian futures. There's a lot of political commentary that's sort of beseeching or rather demanding that Palestinians search for hope, search for inspiration from these protests, which is pretty phenomenal. Because, as I mentioned before, these protests are not about liberating Palestinians from Israeli oppression. It's about reconfiguring the status quo. So I think for a lot of Palestinians, we're looking on with, maybe a little bit of interest, but definitely not with hope that these will bring about any big change in our lives or any kind of dismantlement of Israeli settler colonialism.
I want to go back a little bit to what you touched on earlier, which is the framing of these protests, and particularly the international media coverage of them. It's been centered a lot around Israeli society and, of course, this notion of Israeli democracy. And as you mentioned, the notion that these protests could bring about, some sort of change and even potentially change for Palestinians. But this entire framing and the narrative has ignored the millions of Palestinians that are living under Israeli rule against their will, whether it's in Gaza, Palestinians living under siege or living under military occupation in the West Bank, or even Palestinian citizens of Israel who are treated as second-class citizens. What does this sort of framing that completely ignores Palestinians, what does this reveal about Israeli society and also just about the media and the folks covering this story, about the way that they view the role of Palestinians in this state and in this so-called democracy and the larger Israeli project?
The majority of Israeli society doesn't see Palestinians, certainly not on a day-to-day. I mean, the Israeli regime has built an infrastructure of oppression, which conveniently hides, Palestinians from sight. So for most Israelis, Palestinians aren't even on their political agenda. And we've seen this time and time again throughout elections where Palestinians have not been part of any kind of discussion across the political spectrum, the oppression of Palestinians, that is to say. So I think these protests are very reflective of Israeli society and where it is vis-a-vis Palestinians. And as for the international coverage of the protests, I mean, this is really just textbook standard media coverage where Palestinians and what this means for Palestinian daily life is just completely ignored. You look at the way that the media outlets are framing what's happened since the massive protests we saw over the last 2 days, where Netanyahu has halted the judicial reforms until the summer session, and in return granted Ben-Gvir his own private militia. They've been framing this as a win for the protesters. And in reality, what it is, a further punishment for Palestinians. Ben-Gvir's private militia is going to be unleashed on Palestinians in the West Bank. So yet again, we're seeing Palestinians paying the price. And this is not widely discussed or covered in the international media. Rather, we're seeing these really distasteful comparisons being made between these protests and the protests of the Arab Spring, which is totally, in my mind, not only bizarre, but incredibly offensive. So I think the coverage has been pretty textbook. And that is to say that it's been pretty bad and lacking in nuance. And and really understanding and analysis of the full picture of what's really happening in Palestine.
So you just touched on a really important development, which is yesterday on March 27th, Netanyahu's government announced that it will be delaying for a time the judicial reforms in exchange for giving Itamar Ben-Gvir, who's Israel's national security minister, and for the audience, who may not be aware, Ben-Gvir is a notorious ultranationalist, right-wing Israeli minister who holds extreme anti-Palestinian views and advocates regularly for violence against Palestinians. So he's been given, as you described, this new militia to target Palestinian communities. Could you tell us maybe a little bit more about what you know about that, what it could look like for Palestinians on the ground?
Yeah, I mean, Yumna, you know, as you described him, Itamar Ben-Gvir is an extremist. He's someone who has consistently called for violence against Palestinians throughout his political career. At one point he was considered even an extremist by the Israeli regime, which I think is quite something. And he was a fringe political figure in Israeli politics not long ago. But he since sort of rose to popularity as Israeli society has shifted even more to the right. And he's now a core part of Netanyahu's coalition government, and he was given, as part of the coalition agreement, expanded ministerial file of national security minister, and this position includes not only restoring security to Palestinian majority areas within 48, but also heading the border police unit in the West Bank. And many people feared that this would be basically his private militia. He would use it like a private militia to invoke, or rather to enact even more violence against Palestinians. And so this latest move really is just another gift to Ben-Gvir, who holds quite a strong position in the coalition. Netanyahu can't risk losing Ben-Gvir. If he loses Ben-Gvir, he risks the coalition crumbling completely. And Ben-Gvir was a big proponent of the judicial reforms. So this is, a gift to Ben-Gvir, which of course will come at a huge cost for Palestinians in the West Bank, because he will use this private militia, as I mentioned before. He will use it to collectively punish Palestinians, to win brownie points with his electorate, which seem to revel in violence against Palestinians. So again, we're seeing Palestinians being used as pawns in the Israeli political games, and this is not the first time, and it won't be the last time.
And you said, which I think is quite remarkable, is that this latest move, which happened yesterday to grant Ben-Gvir his militia and to delay the reforms, were celebrated as a win for the protesters. And it was even celebrated by the US and by the Biden administration as a step of, good faith by the Netanyahu government. It was even described by Biden's administration, I believe, as a compromise, which is what the US says it was hoping would happen between the Israeli government and the protesters. But all of that really just solidifies everything that you've been saying and everything that Palestinians have been saying, which is that, compromise at what cost? At the cost of Palestinians. Palestinians have not featured, if, at all, in these protests. Apartheid, settler colonialism, occupation, the siege on Gaza, none of these have been a part of these conversations about Israeli democracy. And yet when it comes to the compromise between the protesters or the protest movement and the government, it's Palestinians who once again pay the price. And quite remarkably, but maybe unsurprisingly, that's being celebrated by, powers and forces like the US.
Yeah, and I think one of the ways in which they so successfully do this sort of twisting the way in which they have this remarkable cognitive dissonance is by separating the Israeli regime from the Palestinians, as if the Palestinian issue is a border issue. It's something that happens outside of Israeli territory, but you can't separate the Israeli regime from what happens to the Palestinians, because the Israeli regime is literally supplanted on top of Palestine. The Israeli regime is the one that controls everything between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea. They control Palestinian lives so intimately. So when we're talking about Israeli politics, you can't say that Palestinians have nothing to do with this, or that the Palestinian issue is separate to this. That kind of separation only serves the Israeli narrative. And I think, it's done on purpose. And it's a very, successful narrative tool to completely marginalize Palestinians from the picture and to erase them from the picture.
As we sort of move into the new phase or the next steps of this kind of moment, I guess, that we're seeing in Israeli society, political pundits online, particularly, have been weighing in, as portraying this as a definitive moment of change, I could say, in Israel. And even some people have gone as far as to say, which you mentioned before, that this could even be a moment of change for the Palestinians. You've talked about this already extensively just in this conversation about how the entire framing of that is completely disingenuous. So I wanted to pose the question to you of what really needs to be done for true change, for lack of a better word, or for true justice to be achieved for the Palestinians who have been totally left out of this conversation.
I think there has to be a real reckoning with what Zionism is and how it manifests itself in Palestine. Zionism is a settler colonial ideology, and its main goal is to erase Palestine and indigenous Palestinians from their homeland. And until there is a recognition of that, until there is a sort of internal recognition by Israelis that is what their whole identity is built around, I don't think we're going to see any significant change.
Dr. Yara Hawari is a Palestinian academic, writer, and senior policy analyst for Al-Shabaka. Thanks so much, Yara.
Thank you, Yumna.
That's our show. Thanks for listening. Mondoweiss is a nonprofit publication with no paywalls. If you would like to support our work, go to mondoweiss.net/donate. Please leave a rating and review to help other listeners find the show. And if you have any more feedback, send me an email at dave@mondoweiss.net. Thanks again for listening. We'll be back soon with a new episode.